Hello again, and welcome to tonight's Alumni Speaker Series, the US-Afghanistan Relationship featuring Baktash Ahadi. I am Becky Bramer-Dietrich, Assistant Vice President for Advancement and a member of SU's class of 1992. We will have time for questions following the presentation, and we will do our best to get to all of them, including those submitted ahead of time. During the presentation, you may submit additional questions in the Q&A feature. I want to acknowledge a few SU faculty and staff who are in attendance. We have President Jonathan Green and First Lady Lynn Buck, Vice President for Advancement, Melissa Kimura, and Vice President for Student Life, Francie McGee. From the faculty, we have Jeff Mann, ML Klutz, and David McLaughlin. And from the staff, we have Sue Ann Rodarmel, Elizabeth McGill, Tammy Beers Franklin, Julie Boggs, Colin Botts, Josie Fertig, Pam Heim, Michelle Sears, Jody Swartz, Susan Kreischer, Stephen Lambert, and Monica Leitzel. To introduce Baktash and to serve as our moderator, we welcome Andrea Lopez, Associate Professor of Political Science. Andrea has been at SU since 2000. She teaches international relations, and her research focuses on counterinsurgency and peacekeeping. I'll turn it over to you, Andrea.
Great, thanks, Becky. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce Baktash Ahadi. Among many other things, Baktash led the congressionally mandated Afghan Familiarization Course at the Foreign Service Institute, where it became the top-rated course at the State Department. He is also the founder and principal consultant of Taleem, a leadership consultancy focused on education, leadership, and behavior change. Rather than a traditional talk, Baktash and I are going to have a conversation informed by the questions that you've posted already. If you have any as we chat, again, as Becky said, please put them in the Q&A section. On a more personal note, I guess we could say, Baktash is a 2005 alum. He majored in sociology and anthropology. And I had him actually in 3 different classes: world affairs, Russian and Soviet politics, and terrorism. I taught terrorism in the fall of 2002. That was the course that Baktash took. And of course, the reason I taught that course was due to 9/11. Obviously, September 11th, 2001, the attack by Al-Qaeda is what launched our involvement in Afghanistan and therefore paved the way for the talk tonight. Tiny bit of background on it. I'm not going to go into depth. I could spend the entire time doing that, but I won't. Al-Qaeda, including Osama bin Laden, had been in Afghanistan since the mid-1990s, after they were effectively kicked out of Sudan. They were given sanctuary, given safe haven by the Taliban, who had taken over most of the country in 1996. After the attacks on 9/11, when President George W. Bush demanded that the Taliban release or give up Al-Qaeda, in particular, again, Osama bin Laden, the Taliban refused, and the United States began launching attacks. And as it supported the Northern Alliance, among other groups, by the end of the year, Kabul fell and the Taliban fled. In April of 2002, President Bush called for reconstruction of Afghanistan. And since that, until August of 2021, the United States had troops in that country. So with that kind of introduction, I would like to just kind of open it up and ask Baktash about what are your memories of 9/11? Because you were newly on campus at that time.
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question, Dr. Lopez. It's so interesting. I remember starting my freshman year at SU, and about a week after I started, 9/11 happened. And I remember it being such a poignant time. It's one of these events, obviously, that takes place and everybody can remember where they were when they heard it. And what's really curious about my experience at SU is that I remember being on a beautiful Tuesday morning. I think it was beautiful all over the East Coast. And it was wonderfully beautiful. And I remember being in Dr. Dr. Schweeder's government class in steel, right when you enter to the left. I'm not sure what room that is, maybe 007.
07.
Yep. And I remember being in that class, and what was really curious is that while we were in class, somebody came to the door and informed us that a building had hit the World Trade Center. And what was really interesting about Dr. Schweeder is that he continued to teach. He continued to teach as though nothing substantial had happened. And what was really curious as being a student is, all of our minds were like, what was going on? Was this an accident? And while we're in his class, the second plane hit the South Tower. Mm-hmm. And that's when we knew that it was absolutely an attack on the United States. It couldn't have been an accident. And so that's when we stopped class, and we all kind of huddled around the TV in a neighboring room. And I remember everybody just being in shock. And so this was my first entry or introduction into how the world kind of takes on a life of its own and can impact us even in Selinsgrove. Right, this was one of those events. And what was really curious is after that, I went to go call my father and ask him how our family was, because we have family in Queens, New York, Dr. Lopez, and they told me that everybody was okay. And I said, Dad, who could have done this? And my father uttered the name Osama bin Laden. And it was at that point I thought to myself, Dad, who are you? I didn't know that you knew these things. One. And then two, what does all of this mean for us being born in Afghanistan, coming to the United States, in particular, central Pennsylvania in 1986? And what was really interesting about the SU community at that time, Dr. Lopez, was that if you recall, the United States was highly and deeply emotional at the time. Mm-hmm. And so the reaction was, and it's something I'd love to kind of, reveal from you in terms of how you kind of dealt with it too, is the reaction was really interesting as being I think one of the only Muslim students, the only Afghan student on campus at the time. Some students were very aggressive towards me, and some weren't. Some were quite curious. And what saved me, though, what I was actually interested in kind of transferring, and what kept me at SU was the reaction of the professors at SU. I had something like 8 professors call me and reach out to me and say, if you need anything, please come to my home. You can stay with us. And it made me feel like I had a great sense of home and belonging with people that I had just met in orientation. Mm-hmm. And so that was why I stayed at SU, because I think there's that sense of service that the university kind of upholds, and that's what I felt coming from the professors. So it was a great way to kind of, I don't know if there was a better place to be outside of my home than SU at that time.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of curious to know if we could kind of talk about what it was like for you as being somebody in the political science department who studies international relations. How did you kind of understand that moment? Mm-hmm. Right, as somebody who studies this as your life's craft, how did you understand that moment? And subsequently, it'd be really curious, I think, for people to understand how you kind of enlightened and informed the SU community as they came to say, Dr. Lopez, how do we make sense of this?
I heard about, I flipped on the TV, having walked my dog and done the normal morning things. And as I came down the stairs in my house, this is for those of you who know me more recently, I lived in Selinsgrove for a while. So this was my house in Selinsgrove. And I now live an hour and a half away. So things have changed. But at that time, I was walking down the stairs, flipped on the TV, and I'm still not sure whether I saw the second plane hit or whether I saw a replay almost immediately after. But, got dressed, went to work listening to NPR, and all I could think was, we're at war. At that moment, didn't know against whom or with whom, but it was clear that this was big. And then turned on the TV in the poli-sci suite and, had it on all day. I think I had an afternoon class that day. I don't recall precisely, but I know in all my classes, the syllabus was just done, threw out the syllabus, rewrote it, restructured everything, because this was a major event. And, I agree with your dad that I, pretty quickly thought it's got to be Al-Qaeda, because there's really no other terrorist organization that can pull this off. There were a bunch who were claiming responsibility, but there's really no other with the reach and the interest in targeting the Americans that could pull it off. My research, as Becky had noted, is in counterinsurgency. And so I had studied civil wars, guerrilla war, not least of all Afghanistan, because I studied the Soviet Union as well. And so, I was kind of, I won't say besieged, but I had a number of, discussions with the press and a lot of, obviously local individuals about what was going on. I think one of the things I did a lot in class, because the students were interested in, obviously Afghanistan and Islam and everything, is I tailored a lot about it, to the limited knowledge that I have, based on really courses that I took in college. But, a lot of them did have a lot of interest. And so it was for my job, largely informing, but also some degree of comforting, because, there were some people who were afraid it was going to hit Selinsgrove, and that we'd have a terrorist attack. And so a lot of it was, using an understanding of these to comfort the students, I think, in some ways. But to also explain, that this really is changing things. We have just shifted from this period of a little over a decade, where we have the peace dividend and life is awesome, and the Cold War is over, so everything's great. And then suddenly we're thrust into conflict again. Not that the 90s were free from that, but we didn't think about it as such. And so it was a big shift in everything. And of course, we are still in that post 9/11 world, and it's not changed dramatically, though we have pulled out of Afghanistan and most of our troops out of Iraq. So I do want to kind of follow up on your experiences, because they're here to hear you. But one of the questions that came up is about your own experiences in Afghanistan, particularly when you served 2010 to 2013 as an advisor, mentor, and translator for the US Special Operations Task Force there. And the question was, this is, of course, right after the surge. The United States under President Obama engages in the surge in December of 2009. So we moved from just under 70,000 to about 100,000 troops at this time. So why then? Why did you go and serve over there in 2010 to 2013? And is there anything you want to tell us about that experience?
Yeah. Thank you for asking the question. Timing is an interesting thing in our lives. And what's really curious is when 9/11 happened and I was at SU, my real interest, Dr. Lopez, was the way I kind of like to talk about is the question that my life followed at SU was, why do people do what they do, and how does the environment inform how people understand who they are, right? And so I went from studying social sciences, and I really focused in on sociology and anthropology, because I was really interested in how societal norms and culture influence people to kind of make the decisions that they ultimately make. And the reason why I thought this was really curious is because the war in Afghanistan had started in 1979. And so my family came to the United States as a direct result of the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. And so my life, as a young boy, started in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But then I had cousins in Queens, and then cousins in Orange County, and then also cousins in Kabul, and also cousins in Pakistan. And we became completely different people, although our parents were the same, and our parents had they all relatively had the same values, except their children all had different values. So the value transfer from one parent to another didn't happen the same way. And so I became keenly aware of that. And so I became really curious about why people do what they do, in particular how an environment informs and shapes people. So that led me after SU. My father and my mother were like, I wanted to take some time after I graduated in 2005, Dr. Lopez, and go and serve in Afghanistan. But if you recall, the US military, the US government was no longer really interested in engaging in Afghanistan. We took off, set our sights quite literally on Iraq. And so I was interested in serving the United States because I still love what America has given to my family, but I was not interested in serving in that war. And so the way I decided to kind of serve was to join the Peace Corps. And so I did, it was one of the best educations of my life. And so for anybody listening, for young people that are listening, and maybe this will resonate with you, Dr. Lopez, is that I think the most important thing that you can do as a young person is get out of your comfort zone, but do it in a way where you engage an individual and or people that have a completely different worldview from you, to understand that there's a different way to understand how you can live, and do it from exposure and engagement. And so that's what that experience taught me. And something really, really, really beautiful about the Peace Corps is as a young 22-year-old, when I graduated, Dr. Lopez, I went into the Peace Corps thinking I was going to go in and change this community. American hubris and American exceptionalism. I know the answer. And this will come up, I promise, as we talk about Afghanistan. But I went into this community and I was an English teacher. And I remember, they would teach me things, my community would teach me things, my students would teach me things. I just said to myself, this is something that was completely unanticipated, unexpected. Mm-hmm. And after my 2.5 years of service, I came back to the United States, and I remember thinking, wow, I was more impacted by them than they were impacted by me. So the gift was very much not me trying to serve them, but them actually serving me, mm-hmm. in a very profound way. And so that brought me to Washington, D.C., and I ended up getting a job supporting counterinsurgency efforts with the Department of Homeland Security. And I was looking for the right time to essentially go to Afghanistan, and lo and behold, President Obama announced the surge in December 2009, like you said, and the timing was perfect for me because I had some experience underneath my belt. I had my security clearance. I'd been supporting the U.S. government, trying to understand counterinsurgency efforts in Afghanistan. And so 1 month later, Dr. Lopez, I was on a plane to Afghanistan. Essentially, a friend of a friend from the DoD called me and said, we're looking for individuals like yourself who can help us essentially navigate, the Afghan population. And before I knew it, I was on a plane and I got there, and I was tasked to work with the US Marines, who are part of the Special Operations Task Force. So the Special Operations Task Force is important to kind of think about. We're elements of the US military, so the US Marines, US aid, and intelligence units. And so we kind of came together, and this was like the only real unit, the only real entity of the US military that was able to go outside the wire. And so other parts, a lot of people may not know this, but a lot of the US presence in Afghanistan, the US NATO presence in Afghanistan, was largely restricted to being on base. So there wasn't a lot of engagement. Mm-hmm. So you would find people many service members that would just stay on bases. I mean, there was Bagram Air Base, there was Kandahar Air Base, there was Leatherneck, and these are massive bases. And at its peak, at the US presence peak in Afghanistan, Dr. Lopez, I mean, these bases had something like 35 to 40,000 people on each one of them. So fundamentally, like remarkably bigger than Selinsgrove, right? And so there were little American towns, quite literally. Mm-hmm. And so I was privileged enough to say, I wanted to get tasked, I wanted to go outside the wire. And so I was privileged enough to essentially go outside the wire and support these elements. So combat missions, intelligence missions, and development missions. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that type of role was that, everybody that I work with went into Afghanistan wanting to provide some value to a people that they thought needed that value, right? And what's interesting about conflict and war is that although the intention may be positive, the shape and form that it takes can be sometimes really detrimental. And what I'm saying specifically is, the United States military, sometimes we would have drone strikes that would lead to collateral damage, where they would miss a target and end up hitting a home that had 12 people in that home. And I remember one of my responsibilities, one of my missions was to go and work with this family to help them and console them about the death of 12 people that essentially that they took on from a drone strike. And I remember having that conversation with a family member of that one of those family members that survived, to say, we're here to kind of say we're sorry, and we're going to compensate you with with some money. And it was one of the most difficult conversations to be a part of, and to essentially tried to navigate. And I share this because I think it's also important to kind of talk about the realities of what war is, right? So we'll go and we'll essentially, there are moments where we free villages from Taliban occupation, but there are also moments where we essentially hurt the people that we're trying to serve. And so this, as a matter of our war and our engagement in Afghanistan, I think it's important to kind of talk about these realities that we're a part of, and in some sense we implemented. I mean, I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that's kind of where my mind went.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm actually gonna ask one of the questions that was just posted, because I think it's really relevant at this moment. But how did your father's knowledge of Osama bin Laden and the fact that he was involved in this so early on influence your decision to get involved in the US?
Yeah, what a lovely question. So my father, how should I say this? My father's one of my parents are my heroes in my life, and they're heroes for the reasons that have now demonstrated to me as an adult. They've sacrificed so much to give their children, me and my brothers, a life that they couldn't have, and that they, in some sense, felt like they didn't deserve. So my father, he ended up working for this the U.S. Pennsylvania court system as a computer operator in Pennsylvania, Mechanicsburg of all places. And so he and I had that conversation about bin Laden while he was working there. And what was interesting is when I told my father, I wanted to go and serve in Afghanistan, he was like, absolutely not. You're not ready. I'm not letting you go. Your mother and I put our lives at risk to take you out. Now you want to go back? This isn't going to happen. Right? Like, absolutely not. Right. And what was really curious is after I'd proven to my father that I was able to be self-sufficient and carve out a life of my own, and essentially become an adult in some sense through the Peace Corps, he felt more confident about my ability to kind of navigate the unknown. And once President Obama announced the surge and I was in the process of getting sent over, I remember calling my father and saying, Baba, I'm going to Afghanistan. And I was expecting him to say, you're not going, right? Like I was expecting a moment of truth, so to speak, right, Dr. Lopez? And it was interesting because I was 28 at the time, and my father simply said, okay, I think you're ready. And so he's quite supportive of it. My mother was absolutely supportive of it. She wanted me to go back. She wanted me to essentially, because half of my family still lives there. And what's really curious that I haven't shared with you yet is that my father eventually came to Afghanistan as an interpreter as well.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he joined 6 months after I came, and he went to his hometown of Kandahar, where he was born and raised. And so my father speaks multiple languages of the region. And so he came and he also served. And what was really interesting about my experience in Afghanistan, Dr. Lopez, was that I spent 6 months in a working relationship with my father in Kandahar. And I'd love to tell you a story about my father because I think it's important. I always thought of my father as somebody who was quite polite, in some sense, passive, in some sense, soft, right? And those are all positive qualities. Don't get me wrong. Those are all very positive qualities. But what I realized is he was this way because he was in an environment in which he wasn't so comfortable in, that being Pennsylvania. So he came to Pennsylvania as an adult at the age of 32, and he had a family, a wife, and he's trying to navigate what it was like to be in America. And so I always saw my father, in some sense, being a little passive. And I thought to myself, that's interesting. I only knew my father through that lens. And so when I went back to Kandahar, I saw my father in a very different light because I saw him commanding rooms of colonels, lieutenant colonels, Afghan commandos in a language that I never heard him speak, that being Pashto, because we speak Dari and Farsi at home. So all of a sudden, I was exposed to a person who had raised me in a way that I'd never anticipated, and it completely changed my perspective on my father. So I grew to really respect and revere him in a very different way. So the question was very much like, how did my father influence my decision to kind of go to Afghanistan?
Mhm.
Well, he was against it initially, then he was supportive. And then while I was there, he showed me a side of him that I didn't know existed. And I just love that about my father.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Given just kind of back to one of the earlier questions, and I see people are popping up questions as they fit into the discussion, I'll add them, else I'll try to get to them after we
Sure.
get toward the end. But given the circumstances of 9/11, it is likely that any president would have gone into Afghanistan. So once involved and once the Taliban was ousted from power, was there anything that the United States could have done to have been more successful, to have enabled the non-Taliban government of Afghanistan to stand on its own? You had mentioned the costs of drone strikes and the term is often used, blowback from collateral damage and the like. So what could we have done?
Yeah.
Could we have done anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. In hindsight, everything's 2020, right? Everything. Mm-hmm. That's one of the detriments of the human condition. That's the thing that gives us a lot of anguish in our lives, doesn't it? Well, I think it's fair to say that the thing that we could have done is in the Bonn conference, where Afghan political elite from all over the world, as well as the United States, met to kind of establish an Afghan government. What could have happened is to give the Taliban political legitimacy at that time. And that's all they were really looking for. But what was interesting about the decision to not give them political legitimacy was the Afghan political elite was so disgusted with what the Taliban brought to Afghanistan as a way of kind of them governing the country. I mean, if you think about what they brought into Afghanistan as a way of their values, they were essentially anti anything progress. And so the political elite that existed abroad in exile that came together to kind of form this Afghan government was so disgusted with who they were and what they made Afghanistan to be that they didn't want to give them political legitimacy at that time. It's also important to say also that, like, when the United States came in to Afghanistan and started the bombings to essentially oust the Taliban out of power in an effort to get Al-Qaeda, the Taliban melted away. They literally vanished across the border. So the thought was, if they were this easy to kind of defeat, we can defeat them again. And if they were this easy to defeat, who were they in the first place? We don't need to bring them into the fold. And what the United States and the Afghan political elite got wrong was that as they were kind of setting up a government, the Taliban was in Pakistan rearming, regrouping, and coming together to say, we're taking back this country that was taken from us. And so I think to answer the question, I think we could have folded them into the political system right when the Bonn Agreement happened to set up the American-backed Afghan government led by Karzai at the time. But again, in hindsight, everything's 2020. The United States was very emotional. We went in with hubris. We went with the sense of we can defeat anybody if they were this easy to defeat. And the Afghan political elite were also not having it. So again, in the context of what you're talking about in blowback, if I'm maybe this is important to share too, is I'm in the process of understanding what wisdom is. Right? And this can be applied to our conversation right now. Is I think wisdom is understanding the long-term implications of our decisions made now. And I think the United States does a terrible job of that writ large politically. And I think that gets us into a lot of trouble. So I just wish we could, as a country, kind of decide second order, third order implications of our decisions when we do make those decisions. Yeah.
We do have a tendency of thinking short term, yes. and no, go ahead.
I'm wondering why you think that's, like, I would love to know why that happens, and maybe it'd be great to kind of fold that into this conversation. Like, where does that come from?
I think some of it is simply our political clock. Is that, representatives are elected every 2 years, presidents every 4 years, senators have that long, 6 years. and so they're always thinking about just kind of the relatively short term, what can I do in 2 or 4 years, as opposed to 10 years down the road, what might this look like?
Yeah, I think that's right. And something else I'd love to add as somebody who studies and thinks about the world through an anthropological lens is, America, we're deeply aspirational.
Mm-hmm.
So, I haven't seen you in many years and it's wonderful to see you, but I'll ask you, like, how's life? And then I'll ask you a very fundamental question like, Dr. Lopez, what's next for you? Right? It's this idea of what is the next thing that you're going to accomplish? What is the next thing you're going to work on? Even if something happened to you that you want to, this idea of failing and failing fast is very much an American thing, right? And so I also think now it's a cultural quality and cultural value that we have as Americans to say, if you're going to do something, do it right away. And if you fail, it's okay, move on to the next thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So wonderful.
So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. Well, let me keep moving because we do have other questions. Sure. There were several questions explicitly about the withdrawal, unsurprisingly, I guess. So just a couple of them to give you a group of things to answer, I guess. Was there ever a way or a time for a more orderly exit? And do you think we helped or hindered Afghanistan by leaving? And should we have left? I guess I would throw those in.
Yeah, these are all great questions. What's interesting is I think a lot of what Afghanistan has always talked about as a narrative was that it was a very complex place to kind of navigate and decide what to do. And I'm not sure if that's fair. I think as it pertains to Afghanistan, and this may resonate with you, Dr. Lopez, is I don't think there was ever somebody in a position of decision-making authority that decided what the goal was in Afghanistan. Right, whether it's military leaders or people in the National Security Council or even the president to say, we are going to Afghanistan to do X. And everything we do from this point forth is going to speak to that goal. So people talk about the Afghanistan war as being a 20-year war. I have my mentor and close friend, my mentor and friend, Ambassador Newman, who's a wonderful individual. He was the US ambassador to Afghanistan from 2005 until 2007, I believe. Please correct me if I'm wrong, somebody out there. But he said something really wonderful. He said, there wasn't one 20-year war in Afghanistan. There were 20 one-year wars in Afghanistan. And the reason why he says that is it's this point of nobody deciding what the goal was in Afghanistan. Were we there to nation build? Were we there to essentially root out terrorism? Were we there to go after bin Laden? Help us understand what exactly was going on, because at no point was the United States technically at war with the Taliban. They were not deemed and or designated as a terrorist group, right? So there's a really complex relationship between the US military and the Taliban, right? The United States could attack the Taliban if they attacked the Afghan government, right? Or they could do it in self-defense, but they couldn't go after the Taliban per se. So all this kind of made it really interesting and fuzzy, and just nobody really was clear about what the goal was there. And so this all matters because as a matter of the evacuation, we realize as a country that, Afghanistan was this thing that political leaders no longer had the political will to kind of support. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have so many things going on here in the United States that are really difficult to kind of talk about, right? Things that have come up as a matter of the Trump administration and some of the policies that they've implemented, and also as a matter of Black Lives Matter and structural racism as it kind of takes place, George Floyd. So there are a lot of things that happen within our country where these political leaders were talking about Afghanistan as a scapegoat to say, we're spending all this time and money and energy in this country, and it's not serving us. So let's take those resources and bring them back to the United States. And what's really curious about that is I don't think that's accurate. I don't think that's fair. I mean, as a line item in terms of the DoD's budget, it was minuscule to essentially have a presence in Afghanistan. Or as a matter of the US troops in Afghanistan, it was like 2,500, right? So my thinking is that the United States, it wasn't a binary decision to stay or go. what could have happened is the United States could have had a very soft and light footprint to maintain the gains that have been made over the last 20 years as a matter of girls, human rights, girls access to education, people feeling safe and or feeling like they go to markets and essentially trade, feeling like the United States also too is a matter of who we are, Dr. Lopez, as Americans. It's, what does it say about who we are in terms of us leaving that country the way in which we did? And so I think obviously the evacuation could have been better. Obviously, when a president makes a decision to leave and then have to send troops back to pull out Americans that were left behind, I mean, these are obvious indications that what was done and the ways in which it was done was unjust, unfair, and it could have been a lot better. I just said a lot of things. I'm not sure if I spoke to the question. Please bring me back if you could.
I think, the answer in some ways reflects the complexity of the decision and the action to pull out, because, President Trump had made an agreement with the Taliban, or his administration with the Taliban, to pull out by February of this year. And then President Biden, who like Trump had long opposed being in and wanted to withdraw, or at least create a minimum footprint, a tiny little footprint. But back in the surge debates, had called for a counterterrorism focus, which is much more like you're describing, a tiny little force whose job it is to primarily focus on on Al-Qaeda and other groups.
Yeah, it would be really great to talk about at this point, Dr. Lopez, is why the war was unwinnable. Right, I think this is something that a lot of people haven't realized, is that although we were fighting a war within the borders of Afghanistan, a lot of what was happening was that these insurgents, the Taliban insurgents, as well as other insurgents of these multiple terrorist groups that were fighting in Afghanistan, they had safe haven in Pakistan. They still do.
Yep.
And so what's really curious about this war was that although the war was fought within Afghanistan, many Afghans that I've spoken to, political leaders, military members, they would always ask, why don't you just go across the border and fight the war in Pakistan? All the bad guys are there anyway. And that's something that doesn't make it into the headlines a lot. And that's something that a lot of people don't know as it pertains to the narrative of the US involvement in Afghanistan. And this speaks to the work that you do, is that, why is it then the United States wouldn't engage and critically talk about these issues with Pakistan, right?
We did. Pakistan generally, there were times, and this was a key point of Obama's attempts to try to quell the war, was to work with Pakistan, who was having its own jump in terrorism, in part by Pakistani Taleem and other groups. But the problem is Pakistan has different interests, and going in to Afghanistan was challenging enough. Going into Pakistan is going to be, exponentially more difficult. And so, but you're right. Most of the, analysts particularly in the last decade of I would say starting around 2005 and on, often referred to it as the AFPAC issue. So Afghanistan, Pakistan issue. You can't separate one from the other. And so, when you have that perpetual sanctuary, it is almost impossible to quell a conflict.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And what's really interesting too is, Dr. Lopez, why is it then the United States? Why is it that we couldn't engage in an attack? Why couldn't we essentially go after the Pakistani military and or the Pakistani government? Like, help us understand, for those that are sympathizers with Afghans, this is something that's always asked of me. Why is it that the United States wasn't more aggressive? Why didn't we take a more aggressive stance toward Pakistan, if that's the case?
Well, in the political sense, I mean, the immediate thought is Pakistan has nuclear weapons. But the secondary issue, I guess you could say, is that there's a bigger geopolitical issue at stake as well, is that, Pakistan is, part of the challenge is that, we have kind of semi-befriended Pakistan, kind of, sort of, and are hoping that it's to some degree in opposition to Iran. You also, of course, have, we also hope to keep it from antagonizing India too much. So you have all of these other competing, contrasting issues going on. And again, you know, Pakistan is, I forget how large it is, 150 million or so, maybe larger. So, you know, it is a massive country. And so the idea of engaging in concerted military operations there is problematic, and our ability to really cause them a lot of economic pain, so economic sanctions. And we did withhold aid and push them. But is limited, and that links as well to a concern back to those nuclear weapons, that, you know, if we say cut all ties with Afghanistan and start to engage in action in Pakistan and engage in military actions there, are we going to antagonize the rest of the population so much that the government of Pakistan falls, and who now controls those nuclear weapons? And so, you know, all of those concerns come in and really limit our ability to do a whole lot.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'm so glad you kind of provide all that color to this canvas. And I think it's also important to say that the reason why Pakistan then too was interested in Afghanistan was that they were implementing what's called strategic depth. Right, so they have an enemy to their eastern flank, that being India, where they're actually shooting bombs and missiles at each other every single day. That doesn't make it into our newspapers and into our media cycles. Yeah. Right, so they're shooting weapons at each other. They have nuclear weapons pointed at each other, and so Pakistan's stance is really interesting because they don't want also to have an enemy on their western flank. So quite literally, they don't want to be sandwiched by two enemies, because Afghan and Indian relations are quite good because they have a common enemy. Right, and so all the things that you're kind of talking about play out in the grander scheme of things in terms of deciding how do we navigate these waters. But I think it's also important to say that the worst decision, I think, was to abandon Afghanistan the way in which we did, because one, it's unfair to the Afghan people. The United States made so many promises to the Afghan people. We are here. We're not going to essentially let all the gains that were essentially implemented falter. We are here and we're committed to the long term. And so people built their lives on that sense of hope. And when the evacuation happened as quickly as it did, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking for so many people. Anybody who had a connection with that country, not just people like myself, but people who had served, right? Like American service members who served in Afghanistan, like the question that's kind of stemming from, kind of surfacing now is amongst all of us, Marines, Army, you name it, was this service, what was the service for? Or are all of our sacrifices for nothing? And so these are the sorts of things that I think are really kind of important to kind of grapple as we talk about what it means to be an American, and how this evacuation actually says more about who we are as a people and how we have to confront that going forward. Yeah.
So one question just came up that builds very nicely off this, and then I'm going to get to kind of some future questions, including another one that's been posted just recently. But question is, I'm curious, if there were a scenario in which the US stayed, how do you see or process the trade-offs between the benefits, such as the continued investment in Afghan women, and the risks from the very likely continued support of a corrupt and unpopular regime?
Gosh, what a complex question. So what's the cost-benefit analysis to have stayed and engaged in Afghanistan? Well, it's a wonderful question. I think what we have to figure out is, we have to remember at the beginning of our conversation, Dr. Lopez, we talked about why the United States went into Afghanistan, right? And went in to make sure that Afghanistan no longer served as a place, as safe haven for Islamic terrorists, right? That could essentially affect us here on our borders. And so in the context of US-Afghan relations, the United States has to figure out, what is it that it wants to do with Afghanistan? And my sense is that the line item is a matter of a budget to stay engaged in Afghanistan is actually not that heavy. In the history of US relations abroad, in the context of a post-World War II, like we have bases, we have 181 bases across the world, something astronomical. Why can't we have one in Afghanistan, right? Like just one. We have We have 180 plus bases throughout the world. Why can't we just have one there? And so I think when we think about Afghanistan, we have to put into context in terms of what else the United States is doing globally. And so for me, that's the thing that I can always ask is, it wouldn't have been so much for the United States to stay engaged as a matter of a line item, as a matter of sacrifices. I think also too, I once read or was told that the number of casualties that happened in training in boot camp with the US military in the United States is actually higher than Americans dying in a post-2015 world in Afghanistan. So I think it's kind of important to put things into context in terms of doing a cost-benefit analysis for the US engagement in Afghanistan. I'm not sure if that was helpful.
Okay, I think it is. And I think we'll get to other elements of that now, in terms of what do you see as the future for Afghanistan, both internally and in terms of US-Afghan relations. And I'm going to start with a specific question on the latter one that was raised. How do you feel about the US freezing the $9 billion of Afghan monies now in US banks, as well as serving as the lead in discouraging IMF and World Bank aid to the new Taliban government? Is this a positive development or just a negotiating tactic by the world community?
Right. So what's interesting is, if it's a negotiating tactic, it's a terrible one. And the reason why is because, again, the people that are making decisions in Afghanistan, they're going to be taken care of as a matter of their well-being. But Afghans, the 30 million plus Afghans that live in the country who don't have access to resources, they depend on aid to kind of have a livelihood. So right now, currently, we're dealing with a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan where people don't have access to their bank accounts. And we're talking millions of people in population centers, right? We have crime that's going through the roof in parts of the country. People are just trying to, there's something happening right now called siege mentality, where people are trying to get what they can while they can. And so freezing of these assets, if it's a negotiating tactic, it's not keeping the everyday Afghan, it's not including the everyday Afghan in the calculation. I think that's a disservice to the people that we've tried to serve over the last 20 years. I mean, if that was the case, if it was a negotiating tactic, then why on God's green earth did we bring the Taliban back into power? Why couldn't we have done this before the evacuation? So for me, that's the thing that I would like to kind of just ask is, if that was the case, then why didn't we do it before? Why don't we, for every position that the Taliban was hedging on and leveraging, the United States and the Afghan government kind of gave them what they wanted, whether it was freeing 5,000 prisoners, whether it was giving them, access to certain parts of the country, just left and right. We were as the United States government, we were kind of just folding into the Taliban slowly but surely. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Okay. Couple of questions about internal. One about internal. About internal Afghan politics. Do you think that the government will end up including any individuals who are not part of the Taliban, or whether this will be a purely Taliban government?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, think about it. So the person that kind of, if people are paying attention once the United States kind of evacuated, was former president Hamid Karzai, was very much a person that was bringing various parties together. And he's the one that stayed. He's one of the people that stayed when Kabul fell. So the sitting president of Afghanistan, President Ashraf Ghani, he fled. And he went to, I think, Kazakhstan, and eventually he made it to the UAE. But President Karzai, he made an announcement the moment Kabul fell. He made a video actually that he posted that went viral of him and his 3 daughters saying, "I'm not leaving Kabul. Everything's going to be fine. Everybody kind of stay calm. We're in a different stage of our lives. Afghanistan's in a very different phase in its life. This is a time for peace and reconciliation. Everybody stay calm." And so there'll be elements of various power brokers, to include President Karzai, Abdullah, who's technically the CEO, who was also governing the country with Ashraf Ghani. These elements and these people will come to the table with the Taliban because one, they have to, and then two, they represent a constituency in various parts of the country where people are looking to them to kind of have them represent who they are to the new Taliban government. So although the Taliban, I think, will be running the country, they'll have members of the former Ghani administration, to include President Karzai and his administration, folded into the government. Yeah.
Kind of in line with that, how might the Taliban be able to improve relations and secure financial aid from the West?
It's a great question. Well, the answer is it's to be seen. We'll figure out whether or not the United States is willing, the West is willing to essentially work with the Taliban. I don't think they're going to work with the Taliban as a matter of their values and their interests, but as a matter of serving the Afghan people. I think that's definitely the case now with various countries that are part of NATO right now, that are going to work with the Taliban and say, we will give you money, but you have to guarantee that it's going to get to the people, in particular humanitarian aid. And so I think that's how it's going to work. Otherwise, I mean, it's important to kind of share too at this point, Dr. Lopez, which you're well aware of, is the majority of the Afghan government for the 20 years that we were involved was very much propped on aid. The country and the government was running on aid money. So if there is no aid money in the country, then all of a sudden the government will cease to exist. Or if they decide to, I guess, rest their laurels on opium production, then it'll take a very different shape and form, because that's an illegal thing that they're exporting. So it's also important to share too that the Taliban is figuring out how to govern. It's not something that they've gone to school for, like yourself. Like, it's not something that they understand. It'd be interesting to see if some of them essentially apply for scholarships, come to the West to essentially study governance, to apply it back in their own country. We shall see. But I think they're also in a very interesting place to figure out how to navigate those conversations. I mean, just recently, they just opened up the office of issuing passports within the Afghan government. And there's so many people that are just wanting to get a passport to leave the country, because they still don't know. Nobody really knows if the Taliban can govern the country properly. Yeah.
One other new question that just popped up was wondering how we can assist the Afghans and not lose what we achieved in the last 20 years, and also make sure the aid does not end up enriching the Taliban government. So you had mentioned governments, and the United States is included here, trying to get money to the people into organizations within the state. But how do we actually, try to support? Is there a way?
That's a great question. Well, in terms of the conversations that I'm a part of, nobody wants to send money to the Taliban because they just don't trust that it's going to get to the people that need it. So what we're doing now is there are many people that are kind of sending money to organizations, schools, NGOs that are essentially doing grassroots sort of development in the country, maintaining girls' schools in the provinces, working to make sure that women essentially have a way to kind of create handcrafts, to have a sense of income to support their families. So there's ways in which people can find those organizations, but my sense is that's the only option right now. It'll be interesting to see. So a bottom-up approach, so to speak, is what I'm talking about. A top-down approach is something that the world is still waiting to kind of figure out to see if the Taliban can do. We're not sure.
Great. I want to ask one question that brings you actually back to your time at Susquehanna.
Great.
And so let me read the question in full. You say while you were in the Peace Corps that they taught you more than you taught them. I am also an anthropology major, and I've taken a class called the Anthropology of Tourism. In the class, we explored the idea that wealthy Americans, or Americans in general, have that savior complex. Was that something you studied as part of your major? If so, was it something you kept in mind while you were there, or was it more like a realization that you came to and then analyzed after?
What a lovely question. It wasn't something that was offered when I was at SU, no. But the savior complex is a matter of going into these developing countries is a very real phenomenon. And I think the advice that I would give to my 22-year-old self would be go into a community, either abroad or even domestically, right? Like we have communities all across the United States, right, Dr. Lopez, that need assistance. Inner cities, Native American communities, Hispanic communities, communities in Appalachia, right? But nonetheless, when you go into a community that's not your own, I think the best way to kind of go into that community and engage that community is through a sense of radical curiosity, which is, I think, the most important way to engage anybody who is different from you and engage anybody who is perceived to be the other. What ends up clouding our sense of judgment is thinking that we know what's best in the world, right? It's a myopic sense of the world that's actually very problematic. So anytime that, if you just kind of think about any time in your life where there's a sense of conflict, the conflict exists because either a person, a community, a society, or a government thinks that it knows something that's better for them in the world that the other party doesn't, right? Like that's why the conflict exists. And so I think the thing that I would say is, when you're going into these communities, if you decide to join the Peace Corps or something like it, or you decide to serve in AmeriCorps or Teach for America or something like that, is to say, what is it that I can learn from this community? What is it that I can learn from my students? And how can that better shape and form who I am as a person? And we can do this on an individual level, a community level, a societal level, and then also on a national level. And I think that's what I would tell my 22-year-old self, is to engage with a deep sense of radical curiosity, so you don't fall victim to, I'm here to save you, but instead, I'm here to essentially learn with you, in collaboration with you, to see what we can do that's better for the both of us.
Wonderful. Well, we are just out of time, so I want to thank Baktash, and I very much want to thank all of you who came tonight. I have been told to ask you all to please check out our alumni speaker series events at www.sualum.com. Most of the events, including this one, are recorded and posted on the university's YouTube channel. And we hope to see everybody at homecoming, October 22nd through 24th. If you can't physically make it, there'll be events online. And so there will be several things live streamed. So again, thank you very much, Baktash. This has been a lot of fun.
The pleasure's all mine. Dr. Lopez, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. And I look forward to the next one. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.